Well, this is my first year here, and I am truly honored to be amongst all of you. You all know like way more about wells than I do. I just like to use math to figure out like how they're getting contaminated and how that's affecting people's health. But I have to say I really admire the people who are out there every day actually drilling wells, keeping them safe, meeting face-to-face with individuals who are worried about their well water and what to do about it. So it's truly humbling to be here amongst you and a great honor. So I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce myself, and then I'll get to the talk. So I am right now head of the Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering at North Carolina State University. We're the state's land-grant university in North Carolina, also the flagship engineering school. My department's really large. We've got about 1,300 students and 55 faculty, which is actually, by number of students, larger than my undergraduate institution. So, like I said, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself, because I am really an accidental professor. Not only completely accidental department head. If you had asked me even 15 years ago, would I be head of a big engineering department? I said, oh yeah, and I'm going to land on the moon too. Although we did just have an NC State graduate make a trip around the moon. But yeah, so a very unusual career journey, and I was really excited to hear Ben Minden's talk. Is Ben here today? He's not here today, darn. Well, he's got a drill, yeah. Well, he really mentioned that his path to becoming a well driller was completely unplanned, as was mine. And like Ben, I was also a math major as an undergrad, but at a small women's college, not West Point, a small women's college outside Philadelphia called Bryn Mawr. My family was really broke, and I got a fantastic scholarship to go there. I was going to be a writer, and why a writer majors in math? Well, I didn't really think about that at the time, but the math was fun and easy, so I took a lot of math classes, but also took a lot of writing classes. And then I thought I was done with school. I did have a short career as a writer at a trade association in Washington, D.C. called the Software Publishers Association. And at the time, I got to meet Bill Gates, and he was like 28, 29 years old. So that tells you how old I am. But it didn't take me too long working in Washington to realize there was a lot more I needed to learn. And through a series of events, I ended up deciding to go back to school and get a degree in environmental engineering, which meant taking some undergraduate engineering classes. And it turns out Steve Wilson and I overlapped, but although we didn't know it. I was started at University of Illinois in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, first taking a series of undergrad engineering classes, then master's classes, and I started in January of 1988, and I think Steve was a master's student then, so anyway, small world. So I wrapped up my master's in 1990, and I thought, okay, done with school. Followed my husband at the time to Washington, D.C., where I got a job at the National Academy of Sciences Water Science and Technology Board working on water policy. And it wasn't long, a short while into that job, I started realizing, wow, there's so much more to learn. I never thought I needed a PhD or wanted a PhD, but I'd love to go back to school. But then what happened in my life is, did anybody ever read Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events? That was like my oldest son's favorite series. And that's really what happened to my life for a number of years. So my first husband got Lou Gehrig's disease. We were very young. I was 30, 8 months pregnant and with a toddler. He was 33. And so that led to a long period of tremendous challenges. And then, so I'm going to just fast forward through all of that to the year 2003. Sort of during that time, I just thought, I would really love to go back to school. There is so much I don't know, so much more to learn. And I happened to get then finally, after all of that, new life beginning. At this point, I have 3 kids, and I got a wonderful fellowship from the National Science Foundation to go back to school. And I found this wonderful program at Carnegie Mellon called Engineering and Public Policy. And since I'd been working in public policy for 13 years, and I really like the tools of engineering, especially the mathematical tools, I thought this is just perfect for me. But I thought going back to school after all these years, I'd better also get a degree somebody knows something about. So I got 2 PhDs, one in civil and environmental engineering and the other in engineering and public policy. And then completely unplanned, I didn't really know what I was going to do, but the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, we have a couple of, at least one alum here, Wilson Mize, I believe, and Andrew George is here. They were advertising for a job as a professor for somebody with expertise in quantitative environmental policy analysis in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering in the School of Public Health. And I thought, well, that really sounds like me, so I'll never get the job, but I applied anyway, got the job, and that's what led me into work on private wells. So shortly after I started that job, which is 2007, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to have lunch with the state's, at that time, new director of public health, Jeff Engel. Do any of our environmental health folks know Jeff? Oh, great. Okay, great. Yeah, really terrific. He ended up being a wonderful mentor for me. About 2009, we're having lunch, and I said, so what are your number one priorities? And he said, well, really top of the list was making sure everybody in the state of North Carolina had safe water and sanitation. And I thought, what do you mean? There are people without safe water and sanitation? Can't we all just turn on the tap and count on safe water and have flushing toilets at home? And he started telling me anecdotal tales about some really dire circumstances. And he said, but he really didn't know how big this problem was. He'd only heard stories. And so I got a grant with him as a mentor and sort of started mapping out in areas where I could, where people are getting their drinking water. And through that, I discovered, just by accident, that there were households relying on private wells that were in urbanized areas, often very close to a community water system. And my students and I started going out to test the water quality in those wells. And we discovered that there were really high levels of just your basic contaminants of health concern, including E. coli and lead, in a fairly substantial number of them. But more surprising to me, I thought the main concern would be quality. I also met people in those communities who didn't have running water at home because in one case, the families, basically their well had run dry. There'd been a lot of development in the area which had really changed the hydrogeology. So this low-income family had paid $10,000 to drill a deeper well, and it also was dry. Down the road from that family, I met an elderly lady who couldn't shower at home because she just got a trickle of water from her well. I met other people in numerous places that had broken well pumps and they couldn't afford to repair them. So that was really eye-opening to discover not only were these quality problems, but that some people just didn't even have running water. So anyway, that's how I really began working on private wells, was thanks to this project with the state health director at the time. But the project I'm going to talk about today is really focused on rural areas. So that early work I did was in more urban areas in North Carolina, around cities and towns where we had populations in densely populated areas where there's, of course, more sources of contamination, which is why we were observing contamination at fairly high frequencies in those areas. So, but the project I'm going to talk about today, we wrote the grant proposal for it in 2019. There was an EPA call for proposals for projects to look at PFAS in rural private wells. And at the time, there wasn't really very much known about how often PFAS were showing up in private wells across the country. There's been a lot more work since then, but there was very little information at the time apart from a few cases where there were known major industrial sources and there'd been some sampling done. And states were really struggling to advise homeowners on what to do, whether to test, and if PFAS were detected, you know, what to test for. And by the way, that picture is me and one of the folks where I worked with in Wake County, North Carolina, testing her water quality on her private well. So that was a long time ago. Anyway, we had 3 objectives. The first one was to basically do kind of like the Trusted Tap project, only a little bit different. We wanted to give people with private wells in multiple communities the opportunity to get a free water test. And we wrote the grant in 2019, were awarded the grant in early 2020, and then the pandemic hit. We had planned to go to these communities and actually go around and collect the samples ourselves in collaboration with community partners, but then we had to get creative, so I'll tell you what we did in a minute. The second one, I said I really like math, so I'm really a math nerd at heart, and I was really interested in figuring out, from the data that we have and the new data we collect, can we predict where PFAS are most likely to occur at levels of concern, just to give information to well owners and state health departments. Where do they need to be looking? And then can we develop like a nationwide map to kind of map out where the hot spots might be? So I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, most especially Jenny Hopenick-Redman at RTI. RTI is the Research Triangle Institute. It's a nonprofit research institution based in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, but with offices all over the world. They're an amazing place, and Jenny is a force of nature. She is the one who designed our mail-out test program. Wendy Brun specializes in risk communication, and I've worked with her for a long time on looking at better ways to communicate risks to private well owners so they feel empowered to take action. And then 2 chemists. I am not a chemist, I'm a mathematician. Don't ask me any chemistry questions, please. I'll turn them over to John. But Shamindu Lianapatirana at RTI really led the analysis of most of our samples, and then Amina Salamova is an analytical chemist at Emory University. So our first objective, like I said, that's my colleague Jenny. We had to get creative. The pandemic's breaking out. Everything's online. So Jenny and team designed this really awesome sample kit that we could mail out to people. We had partners in every community that we worked with who helped us get mailing lists and spread the word. And there's Jenny. We created a little YouTube video to train people on how to collect their samples. We also offered real-time training online for folks when they signed up for the study, and then they could return their sample for free, and we would arrange for UPS to come and pick it up at their home, so they didn't even have to drop it off. So we had really good participation. We tested, I shouldn't say we, that would be my chemistry friends, for 25 PFAS that were kind of the common analyte list at the time. And that's just a list of all of them. You don't really need to worry about it, although John might be interested in the details. I mentioned we had 4 partner communities. One thing we wanted to understand is, does the PFAS kind of fingerprint look different if you're near a known major source of a different kind? Somebody asked about how often AFFF, firefighting foam, is a source of PFAS. So one of our communities was not too far from here in Spokane, Washington, where the Fairchild Air Force Base used firefighting foam for a long time, creating a plume of PFAS contamination. In that area, there's about 60,000 people on private wells. The second one was Washington County, Minnesota, where the 3M plant is, which manufactured PFAS for a long time. Who here is from Minnesota? I know we have some folks. So you guys have been worried about PFAS longer than just about anybody. And really, there was a lot of information. So that was one of our partner communities. One was Monroe County, Indiana, which is just on the border of a karst region in southern Indiana. And we mapped out sources, and there's really no known major sources in that area. So we thought it would be good as like kind of a background site. And then Robeson County, North Carolina, we've had a big PFAS disaster in North Carolina due to the Chemours chemical manufacturing facility that created widespread contamination in surface water and also groundwater in the region. And I have a long-standing partnership with some organizations in that county, which is right near this big facility. So that's where we went. I'm going to jump right ahead to the results. And there's a lot going on here, but what you see is these are the 4 different counties. Remember, in the third column, let's see, is this? I guess I can't really use, but you'll see Monroe County, Indiana in the third column. That's where we weren't aware of any major sources. And on the vertical axis, that's the sum. That's the total concentration of all the 25 PFAS that we measured. And it's on a log scale. So as you go from one notch to the next, that's like a factor of 10. So the lowest notch, just 1 nanogram per liter, all the way up to the last notch is 1,000 nanograms per liter. And what you can see in Monroe County, Indiana, very few of the wells had any detectable PFAS. So you hear people say PFAS are everywhere, but they're really not everywhere to the same extent. We did find some hits, but you'll see the concentrations were, even the totals there were about 10 nanograms per liter, which was much lower than these areas where there's known sources. You can see Washington County, Minnesota, that's the second column. That's where concentrations were highest, and PFAS were detected in most of the wells, and that's again where the 3M site is and has been for a very long time. The second highest levels were in Robeson County, Minnesota. That's the far column. Robeson County, North Carolina. That's around the Chemours Fayetteville Works. And then still high but lower than around these major facilities was around the Air Force Base where AFFF was used. So we can really see from these results the influence of the major sources. So it really does matter where you live and what's in the neighborhood of your well. And by the way, in North Carolina, one of the other projects I worked on was helping the state figure out why the pattern of PFAS in private wells didn't match what they were predicting from their groundwater models. And I'm going to talk a minute about machine learning, but there it turned out that a lot of PFAS were being emitted through the stacks and transported via air and then percolating through the ground. So there was this broad distribution of PFAS from air emissions. These charts kind of show the mix of different PFAS. The chemists like John divided PFAS into different big categories. So the chart on the right side is just kind of the 3 major categories. And you can see that the balance of them differs by the different sites. And then more detail on the individual PFAS analytes on the left. Again, these are really different fingerprints for these different sites, really showing that the type of source does matter. And what those charts are showing, it's kind of the percentage of the total PFAS. It's not the amount, it's what percent is PFAS of a certain type. And John could tell you more about why it is that Washington County would have more what are called PFECAs, perfluorocarboxylic acids, whereas Monroe County, the levels were very, very low, but what we tended to find was more often a perfluorosulfonic acid. And so anyway, you can see these different signatures. And we wanted to know from participants, we spent a lot of time working out how we were going to communicate the results of the study to help people understand. That's where my friend, the risk communication specialist, the cognitive psychologist came in, Wendy Brundebrun. She helped us design the training and also all the report back materials. And we can see that this mail-out test procedure, people were very satisfied with it. That's on the top. Almost everybody was very satisfied, or at least satisfied. I think we had 1 or 2 people that weren't satisfied, and I forget what the problem was there. But and then the report back, high levels of satisfaction. I can share our report back materials with anybody if they want, but they included a recommendation about whether a filter was recommended, and if so, what kind of filter might be useful. So people also appreciated that. And I think most importantly for me is that most people who participated either strongly agreed or agreed that they felt much better, that they were empowered to know what to do about their water quality after participation in this study. So interestingly, people's behavior did change. About half of our participants actually went ahead and purchased a filter after participating, but the number of people that did so varied really depending on how much PFAS. So on the right side, you see the percentage of people with high levels of PFAS detected who went ahead and purchased a filter. Some with low levels and no PFAS detected also decided to purchase a filter. But that was interesting. And I'm not reporting it here, but interestingly, some people actually started drinking their well water again after our study, either because we found low levels and they decided they weren't worried about it, or because they got a filter. And so that was nice to see also. And then, like I said, I'm really a mathematician at heart. One of the things I like to do is look at patterns. So we had pre-existing data sets from 2 of our case study sites, the North Carolina one, a relatively small data set, PFAS measurements from about 1,200 wells that the state had collected and shared with us. Minnesota, 12,000 observations collected by the state health department over about 20 years. And we wanted to see again, can we explain what's driving the different patterns of PFAS occurrence? Why are levels in some wells higher than others? So I'll talk a little bit about the North Carolina one. And in North Carolina, what we did is we also, when I was getting my degree in environmental engineering, I learned a little bit about how you build a mathematical model the traditional way. If you want to figure out, you dump something on the ground or you have a contamination source, where is the contamination going to go? Traditionally, the way that's done is to really look at the physics, the chemistry, and the biology of the groundwater system. So if I pour this much mass of contaminant here, given what I know about the physics of how the water flows through the ground and interacts with all of the aquifer material that it encounters, the chemistry of those interactions, how contaminants might interact with other constituents in the water, or attach to some of the solids in the aquifer. The biology, some things are biodegradable, not really PFAS, not in normal environmental settings, and we predict. So what would we see if we use that? And so I wanted to compare this sort of traditional approach that I was trained on with modern approaches. Everybody's hearing a lot now about AI, but we were doing this in 2019, 2020. This is before ChatGPT. And the type of machine learning models that I use are not large language models. They're models that look for patterns in sets of numbers. Take a big, huge data set with many columns and many rows and try to explain what's going on in this big data set. And so I really like to use an approach called Bayesian networks. They're very transparent. They were really pioneered by one of the fathers of artificial intelligence, Judea Pearl, who's a computer science professor at University of Southern California, won the Turing Award for his kind of invention of this technique. And this technique, he was inspired to really think about how the human brain works. So it's similar motivation, but very different approach than the kinds of AI that are used in ChatGPT. So these Bayesian networks consist of 2 components that you can learn from the data, or you can build from the ground up using expert knowledge. And I in this case, we're learning from data. And the one component is this, it's called a directed acyclic graph. The little round circles are variables. In the middle is what we're trying to predict. In this case, we were trying to predict kind of the signature compound from the Chemours facility in North Carolina. It's a PFAS called Gen X, and that's not the same as people born, what was it, after, I forget what year, 1964 maybe? John, are you a Gen Xer? Oh, right. Oh, okay. Well, anyway, I can't remember if Gen Xers are before or after millennials. I think they're before. Before, okay. Well, here we're talking about a short-chain PFAS compound that was a replacement for more traditional PFAS, and then turned out to also be very mobile and have health hazards. So around it are different factors that we found predict how much of that we're going to see in a well water sample. And all those edges show how things are related. So not only are some of these factors like the ground elevation influencing how much Gen X is in the water, but also some of the other variables. So that's what these networks do. They look for these patterns, how things are related and explain each other. And then the underlying part is, it's called a conditional probability table, and it says how often are you likely to find like a high level of Gen X, that's the bottom row, given a value of another variable. In this case, it's the depth of the well. So you can see shallower wells, 80% likely almost to find Gen X, whereas the deeper wells, especially the ones deeper than 55 meters, very unlikely. So what we did is we developed a big data set. We had these measurements, and we thought, what are all the possible sources of PFAS to these wells? At the time, Chemours was saying, actually, it's not all from us. It must be from septic systems, maybe fire stations, waste disposal sites. You know, they didn't want to be fully responsible for it. And so we actually built a data set that said for each well, how far away is it from all these other sources? And we also included with that information about the soil, the type of land use and land cover, the climate. What we found, the short answer is that these machine learned models were more accurate than the traditional modeling approach that we use in environmental engineering, according to 3 measures of accuracy. And overall accuracy is the first thing, like how often does it get right, whether there's a lot of this particular PFAS in a well or less of it. And that there's 3 different machine learned models we tried. 2 of them are informed by the groundwater model. 1 is just purely machine learned. And then the dark bar that's our mechanistic approach. The accuracy measure we care most about is the one in the middle. And that is how often, if a well is really going to have a level of Gen X above a health threshold, how often does it get that one right? And you can see here the machine learned models, the 3 green bars, all did a lot better than the traditional model. So anyway, that was interesting. The last thing that we wanted to do is, again, create this nationwide risk map. And how did we do that? Who's heard of the EPA PFAS analytic tools? Okay, many of you have. For those who haven't, EPA has compiled a publicly available data set that lists locations of every known potential source of PFAS that they're able to get in their records. There's a wide variety of sources, and this is a map showing the locations of all the different sources across the US. And we thought, well, let's see how well what is in this PFAS analytic tools data set actually predicts what we observed in the 4 communities. And then let's build a risk map using this information and a computational model, and then let's test it on, more broadly. So we gathered up a data set of previously published work from about 10,000 wells. And this is the answer to the question of, in our data set of the wells that we recruited for our study in 4 communities, what was really related to how much PFAS we were finding. And I mentioned that the PFAS analytic tools has many, many different kinds of sources. For the 4 communities we looked at, some turned out to be much more important and others not very important at all. The 4 sources are listed on the vertical axis. At the top is known PFAS production facilities, then Superfund sites where PFAS are known to have been released through a spill, for example, other spill sites, federal facilities that use PFAS, and then some other types of sites down toward the bottom. And anything that is to the right of that red dashed line means that is a significant predictor of how much PFAS you're going to find in the well. And the farther it is to the right, and the kind of more to the right, especially that bar around it, which is called a confidence interval, the more important that source is, and the more likely it is to really be a significant source. And so that was interesting. We could see again that the most important is really these production facilities. Superfund sites were also important, and of course the federal facilities, spill sites. I do want to note that one of the things down at the bottom that turned out not to be important, PFAS analytic tools shows where wastewater biosolids are generated. John mentioned that wastewater biosolids, which historically were spread on agricultural land as a source of fertilizer, have turned out to have this unintended negative consequence of having a lot of PFAS, because you may flush PFAS down your toilet, you use it in your household. These municipal treatment facilities may also process industrial wastewater. What we found is just that where those biosolids are generated isn't really the important thing. You need to know where they're applied, and that's not included in the EPA PFAS analytic tools data set. So if you really want to know whether biosolids are important, you need to know whether they were applied near your well. So we do have this map that we've developed, and it's going to be publicly available in the coming months. I want to say it's interactive, and my colleagues at RTI are finishing it up. It will be launched as soon as we get our paper published on it. We didn't want to launch it publicly until the map goes through peer review for a scientific publication. We have compared it. So recently in Science magazine, now if you ever get an article published in Science, like that's the pinnacle of academic accomplishment for a professor. I've never had anything published in Science. Anybody here published anything in Science? It's a really big deal. Well, in 2024, some scientists at the USGS actually got an article published in Science. Big feather in their cap. They developed a big map to predict where PFAS, the likelihood of PFAS contamination in groundwater at depths used for drinking water extraction. And we said, well, let's see how accurate our map is compared to their map, based on getting this data set together of 10,000 different PFAS observations from various kinds of groundwater wells. This measure of accuracy, as I'm showing you this, what we want ideally is a curve that shifts more up to the left. That means you are more likely to get a true positive, that is, accurately identify a well that really has a lot of PFAS without having to call too many false positives. So we all are familiar with this in like medical testing, right? We might take a COVID test and it might tell us we don't have COVID when in fact we do. That's a false negative. But you can have the other where the test says you have COVID and you really don't. That's a false positive. But we really care about making sure we catch all the true positives. So our map, that's ours, is in the kind of yellowish orange, and you can see that it's farther up toward that desired region than the USGS map was. So the USGS produced two different predictions, one for domestic wells and one for public wells, and ours did better than both. So just wrapping it up, we really found that where your well is located relative to major sources really matters. Different sources have different PFAS fingerprints, so not all PFAS are the same, and they're not found in equal mixes everywhere. The study participants really appreciated being able to get their water test. These modern machine learning approaches appear to show real promise for helping us make better predictions. And our map is going to be available soon. So thank you. I think I went a little long, but we still have 5 minutes for questions. Oh. Okay. What percentage of samples were unsatisfactory or out of hold? None of them that we included in our analysis were out of hold time. Yeah, I mean, we were pretty strict in that, and we had strict QA, QC procedures as well. So people were instructed to, we sent cold packs with their kit, and they had to ship it back overnight. All right. There's more. We've got a manuscript published on that in Environmental Science and Technology. It came out in end of 2025, so you can read about the QA in the supporting information in that manuscript. So look for it in Environmental Science and Technology. How many participants were included in our study? 269. That's all we could afford with the budget that we had. And again, we selected them with help from, we had community group partners and health department partners in every study site, and they really helped us get the word out, but it really was first come, first serve, so that is a limitation in the sense that it wasn't a random sample. Yeah, Okay, what are the characteristics of PFAS movement in groundwater, such as its speed and the factors influencing its migration? Wow. Well, I just look at the math and the patterns that emerge. So characteristics is that the closer you are, obviously, to a site, the more likely it is that you are to have higher concentrations of PFAS. So that reflects kind of the speed of travel. Factors that can influence migration include PFAS tend to sorb to solid materials in the subsurface, so that will influence their transport, and that amount of absorption that occurs really varies a lot depending on the type of PFAS and the nature of the groundwater system that you're in. Okay, how do we get land-applied sites added to the EPA list? Gosh, I don't know. It's really hard. I know in North Carolina, one of my colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill a number of years ago got a whole bunch of paper and PDF files about where land-applied biosolids were applied historically and like digitized all of that. I don't know where it stands in North Carolina. Maybe Wilson knows, but I don't know. I think the problem is that states don't really collect that information uniformly. Steve, is that right? Counties do. But it's not reported up to the EPA yet, I don't think. State primacy agencies. So EPA needs to work with the state primacy agencies, I agreed. Yeah. Well, fingerprint groupings, yeah, you could see the military site, again, that was the Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, and it had a fingerprint that was consistent with firefighting foam. Yeah. Okay, next one. Do you have a mailing list for when the map goes live? I'm looking forward to it. Send me an email. That's a good idea. We're certainly going to send it to all of our participants and community partners. It'll be a few months because my colleague Jenny really wants to aim high, so we are aiming for science. It's very hard to get published there, but we thought since they published a previous map, they might appreciate that this one's a little bit more accurate. All right. Okay, last question. Can I comment on the capacity to take action to remediate PFAS varying by oh my goodness, yes, it's a big problem. I've even found in previous work that low-income people, one of the reasons they don't tend to get their well tested, even if they know they should, is that they don't necessarily want to get bad news that they can't afford to fix. Not only is the cost of testing a barrier, but if you even offer a free test, some folks won't take it up because they'd rather just ignorance is bliss kind of situation. So it's a really big problem, and I really think it's a problem we need to do something about at the national level. I'm quite passionate. I think every single resident of this country deserves to have water at home in adequate quantity that they feel safe using for their everyday needs. Big problem.